Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank you, Thomas, and the organisers of this symposium for inviting me. I last came to Turku when I was 18 years old and was en route hitchhiking from London to Helsinki. So it is, and that was in the middle of the summer. So it's fabulous to come back after all of this time. This morning we've heard about history. We've heard about a broad historical overview of migration and environmental change itself, and then about the history of research into migration associated with environmental change. And I'm going to shift the focus this afternoon and think about the future. The fundamental question that I want to address, and I've been asked to address, is how changes in the environment are shaping and will shape human migration patterns during the 21st century. And of course, we have already touched on this a little bit during the morning session. We've heard about the IPCC report of 1990, which said that displacement and migration of millions of people could be the gravest effect of climate change. Now, I'm not personally convinced that that is a good way of phrasing it, and I would point out that that was the 1990 IPCC report. There have been subsequent IPCC reports that have taken a different view. And we've also heard even some figures from Norman Myers. These are much quoted figures. Etienne actually put up the lower of the two figures Norman Myers has talked about and has been widely quoted as talking about 150 to 200 million climate refugees by 2050. And Etienne rightly pointed out that I've been quite critical of those figures. Again, I would just note Norman Myers is not a migration specialist, he's not a social scientist, he's an environmental scientist. He's also, and I think this bears mentioning, a former patron of the Optimum Population Trust, an organisation now known as Population Matters, which calls for a kind of a maximum size of the world's population. It is essentially a neo-Malthusian approach to population. Amongst other things, Population Matters has called in the UK for an optimum population of 30 million. Our current population is 60 million, just over. It's called for zero net migration, and it also called for the UK not to accept Syrian refugees during the most recent crisis in the Middle East. So I just put that in by way of context because I think it is quite important to understand where ideas are associated. So my idea this afternoon is to focus on the global scale and the decade-long timescale, in line actually with the way that Norman Myers has initially framed this debate. I might, if I'm lucky, live until 2050, hoping. So what changes in migration associated with environmental change might I expect during the remainder of my life, or more plausibly, during the working life of some of you at least in the audience? And I want to address that in this presentation in four parts. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about how we conceptualize this in the first place, because there's no good... I seem to have moved on for some reason. Come back. Okay, I'm going to start this presentation again. Oh dear, I think I might have switched it off. Shall I keep talking while Thomas fiddles? Yeah, so first of all, I'm going to talk about how we conceptualize this, because it's no good seeking to predict the future without understanding what exactly it is we're trying to predict. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the current trends and the extent to which that's migration is associated with climate change right now. I'm then going to talk about how we might project to the future and set out one way of doing that. And then, given that this draws on work that I started doing just a little under 10 years ago, so this draws on a report that I was involved in producing back in 2011 that was responsible for the spike in publications in Etienne's graph in 2011. So the work for that started in 2009. So now that we're in 2019 and we were using a 50-year timescale for that project to look at the future, what does it look like has happened over the last decade, the first of the 5 decades that we were looking at? I think this might be the point at which I wanted to go on to the first slide, but never mind, I seem to have single-handedly killed the system. So first of all, what questions should we be asking? And actually the question that I want to ask here is not how much climate migration will there be in the future, but rather how much will migration in the future differ from current migration patterns? And insofar as it is likely to differ from current patterns, why is that likely to be the case? Is climate change likely to be a significant factor looking into the future? Have I trodden on something? I think I might have pressed that button. That was where it went.
Yeah, please carry on. We will do our best. Yeah. We will just have a bit more company up here.
Okay. So, I would argue there has been a tendency in the migration and climate debate either to put current migration to one side altogether and to talk in a narrow way about climate migration, climate refugees, environmental migration, environmental refugees, as a completely new form of migration that we are looking at in isolation. Or alternatively, there's been another strand of this, which is to look at existing migration flows, but then to try and mobilize arguments as to why we should see these flows as actually motivated by climate or in some way climate related, whether that's migration from Africa, flight from Syria, Mexico to US migration. I've seen all of those. Aha, we're back on my screen here at least. All of those have been described by at least one author as an example of environmental migration. And I think we need to, okay, yeah, that will do. This isn't going to go forward automatically, right? Oh, it's not up there yet. Okay. So, I think this is not unrelated to Etienne's point this morning, that notwithstanding the fact that authors as broad in their political orientations as Peter Kropotkin and Ellen Semple talked about climate change as it's going on its own. That was what I was trying to stop this doing.
Yeah, I cannot help that.
Okay, let me.
Keep it like that. Maybe stop all automatically.
I think there is an automated animation so that it goes on regardless of where you
It does, doesn't it?
If you could unclick that use timings tick box, maybe that might help.
So to the right?
Yeah, further right, there is a tick box use timings. If
Ah.
you, maybe now
Now it's going to work, isn't it?
potentially.
So yes, notwithstanding the writing of Kropotkin and Semple back at the turn of the last century, the reality is that a lot of migration literature has either ignored or deliberately discounted climate change as a factor causing migration, and that is perhaps a good reason for going the other way and focusing very much on migration. But my argument would be that what we really need to do here, the real challenge, is to look realistically and dispassionately at the actual salience of climate change or other environmental change as a factor influencing migration, and therefore leading to migration rising or indeed falling, which is something that might happen. So my starting point would be not only that there is no such thing as climate migration, but also, a little bit more controversially, I would argue there is no such thing as economic migration either, at least in an intellectual sense, and no such thing as a political refugee, except in so far as our current public policy defines refugees in those terms. And also, so a focus, therefore, on mixed migration, to coin a phrase that I'm not entirely happy with. And then also to remind ourselves that what we should probably be most concerned about is net change, indeed, in this presentation, net medium to long-term change. And we should understand the difference between net medium to long-term change and short-term spikes in movement. So that's a kind of a starting point. And then drawing from that, we ask the question, will environmental change become a more or less powerful driver of migration over this time period to 2050? We're now talking about the next 40 years. So we can easily identify what we believe to be the increasing salience of climate-related factors that influence migration. Floods or drought, for example, are pretty good evidence that floods are becoming more frequent, certainly in some parts of Europe. Middling evidence, I think, about whether droughts are becoming more frequent or not, but anyway, some concern that they will. But the key thing here is not whether those factors are becoming more important, and not whether those factors influence migration in some way or not, but whether these factors are becoming more salient as drivers of migration compared with other factors that also at the same time drive migration. And this is difficult because we are trying to do this in the 21st century, not the 13th century. And there are, I would argue, some quite important differences between the 21st century and the 13th century. In fact, Dirk started this morning with hunter-gatherers, where there is arguably a very clear link between the environment, people's use of it, and where they are located. And he gave us the 13th century example, which incidentally I think is a fascinating example of migration in Austria, mining in Austria associated with the destruction of the surrounding woodlands and what that might mean for human habitation and people's ability to live in that area. So it's not just a question of hunter-gathering or agriculture have direct links with the land, mining perhaps not such a direct link with the land, but there's still a pretty present reason why that would influence ability to live in that locale. And I just want to tell you a little story which is not about migration at all, but it's part of my other life at the moment as a senior university administrator. So we're building a new building for my college of social sciences in Birmingham. And at the planning stage, the planners did not like the colour of the external panels that were going to be put around the building. And they wanted a different colour. So to comply with planning, we had to find a different colour stone. the stone was only available in the United States. So we have bought the stone in the United States, and then the company that provides that stone cuts it to make kind of facings for buildings in China. So our new building is going to have some wonderful new paneling on it, and I know about this because a combination of difficulties with the procurement in the United States and then the Chinese spring break meant that our project is now 5 weeks delayed. Okay, so we have a building project in Birmingham that is delayed by 5 weeks because of the Chinese spring break. So this isn't about migration, but it's an indication that the world is a very complex and interconnected place, and that may or may not have something to do with mobility. But insofar as it does, it's not even the simplistic one that you might think, that we're now more globalized and therefore people can move more. This doesn't involve movement at all, but it does it disrupts the more obvious link between what you're doing in a particular place and the way that resources are used in that place, and therefore the ability of people to live in that place. Anyway, that was a bit of digression. Just to go back, we should be interested in the salience of environmental factors influencing migration compared with other factors. And then also it's worth asking, and we set out in our 2011 project to ask, given the slow pace of climate and environmental change, the lag between public policy, public action, and an environmental or social outcome, a key question, in fact, the reason for asking a 50-year question in the first place is there anything that we could or should be doing now that will avert a problem in 50 years' time? So that's kind of where I want to get to at the end of the talk, although I may or may not manage to get all the way there. I mean, implicit in this last question is, what do we want to influence? Quite a bit of the migration and climate debate has as its starting point an assumption that it's migration that we want to influence, and indeed an idea that climate migration is a problem, and this is effectively how and why it can be securitized. But would it be a good thing if we could identify public policy measures that we could take now that would reduce migration in 50 years' time? I'm not sure. And part of what I'd like to encourage people to do, what I've been trying to do myself, is to think of other questions that we can ask of migration that are worth answering on both a short and a long-term timescale. I mean, the most obvious one that people default to beyond can we influence migration is can we make migration safer? If it's going to happen, can we make it safer? And that often defaults to can we make migration, regular migration, planned migration is good, unplanned, irregular migration is bad. I'm not even sure of that, and again, a little digression. I did my PhD many years ago now in northern Portugal, where a large number of people had moved out, not for environmental reasons, although there was an environmental link there too, which I was exploring when I did my PhD. So people moved out of northern Portugal to northern Europe, particularly to France and Germany and Switzerland in the 1960s and 1970s. I interviewed them in the 1980s, including people who had come back. Broadly speaking, people who had left legally through a regular migration program from northern Portugal at that time either got a worse deal because they were on short-term contracts that were tightly controlled by employers as a way of trying to keep down wages and conditions, even though the European labour market at that time was crying out for workers, and therefore workers' conditions were improving. So that was, so if you got onto one of those schemes, that actually wasn't a very good scheme to get on because it meant that you got poor conditions, poor wages. Or alternatively, you got onto one of those because those schemes were controlled by wealthy and well-connected people associated with the Estado Novo, the dictatorship that was in charge of Portugal at the time, and it meant that your experience was fundamentally different. It meant essentially that you were connected to the Portuguese dictatorship. So, put simply, regular migration was not an option for most, but it was not even actually desirable. Traveling illegally in the 1960s was in some respects less risky and more rewarding for migrants. But anyway, let's get back to environmental migration, because I'm aware that I'm digressing a little. So the first thing to say is that climate change is real, and I try to say this in any talk that I give, because sometimes I'm misinterpreted when I try to put environment and migration in context as being somehow saying that, being in the camp of climate deniers, and I am not. So if we look at the last IPCC report on 1.5 degree world, which I think is the most recent thing that the IPCC have produced, what we see is we can expect warming everywhere. By the way, that's not bad everywhere. In the temperate world, this will increase the growing season, reduce the number of frost days, and have a positive effect on agricultural productivity. I doubt that it will have much impact in attracting migrants. I might be wrong, but I doubt that those environmental improvements associated with warming in certain parts of the world will attract people. But we can also, and this is clearly documented, expect more extreme weather events, or at least more intense extreme weather events, especially tropical cyclones. We can expect a rise in sea level, and we can expect lower rainfall in some places, contributing to the risk of drought, but also higher rainfall in other places, contributing to the risk of flood. And the key question here is not whether all of those things are happening. I believe that they are happening and will happen, and that's on the basis of reading the scientific evidence, although with the caveat that I am not a climate scientist myself, so I'm relying on the peer review of colleagues in environmental science to tell me those things, but they seem to me to be well evidenced and published in reputable places so that we can believe them. So the question is not, are those happening, but the question is, in the future, will they lead to migration? And the problem here is that quite a lot of public debate about climate refugees and climate migrants, and indeed a fair amount of the climate migration academic literature, has simply been too simplistic about the assumptions that what's going on here. In other words, if a place is hit by floods or drought or sea level rise or unbearable temperature extremes, people will move, and this is migration. And that's a problem. And very occasionally they might get onto and there are some parts of the world where temperatures will be increased temperatures will be a positive, and then maybe people will move to those places, further north in Canada, further into Siberia, and so on. But this is not it. And why? And this is where we can move on to the first slide. You've seen some of this already. The challenges in forecasting migration are many. So first of all, as I've already said, there's pre-existing migration. It's not that we're trying to predict something new, it's that we're trying to predict how something that is already happening will change, so we need to understand the net effect. A second problem is that migration is not a sum of individual decisions, rather it is also a social process, embedded in households and communities. So if we think about what migration means, and therefore what our conceptualization of the problem is that we are analyzing, there is a world of difference for a place where people are migrating from, depending on whether just some individuals go, even quite a lot of individuals might leave, and losing whole families, or indeed whole communities. So we have some examples in the past of places where, for environmental or other reasons, whole communities have left and settlements has essentially died. We have other places where whole families move, but some people stay behind. And then we have other places where lots of people move, but most families have some people who are left behind. Now, this is not the moment to go into what the relative merits of those are in different contexts, and it depends what your lens is as to whether you think any of those are good or bad things. You know, is it a bad thing that the island of St Kilda is no longer inhabited? Possibly not, but that's one extreme. The point is we're talking about different things here, and we need to understand those as different things from the context of the sending area. There's also the fairly obvious issue that migration can be short-term, long-term, permanent, reversible. There's not one simple thing called migration. We've had a big debate in the UK recently about whether student migration is migration or not. Most universities getting very upset by our government calling student migration migration. Very small number of people in universities, myself amongst them, saying, well, you know, actually, if you go to the international demographic definition of migration, student migration is migration. If people stay for more than a year, it is demographically migration. But of course, what the universities are saying in saying the student movement of students is not migration is they're pointing to the fact that there is something intrinsically different about somebody moving around the world to study compared with somebody moving around the world to work. So our definitions may be clear, but they may also not be so helpful. And linked to that, movement can be forced or voluntary, planned or unplanned, safe or unsafe, regular or irregular. And this certainly matters for the individuals and families involved. It also probably impacts on the long-term sustainability of the process, both for the place of origin and the place of destination. Movement can be to different kinds of places. People can move from poorer and less resilient places to richer and more resilient places. That's kind of what that's the kind of racialized bias that Etienne was talking about this morning. But actually, of course, people move from poorer and less resilient places to even poorer and even less resilient places. That's kind of probably bad. They can indeed move in completely the opposite direction. People move internationally or internally, and even that, and quite a lot of attention now paid to internal versus international migration in the literature, but you need to factor in there the vastly different size of countries in order to understand what it is we're talking about. I mean, put simply, you can go an awful long way in China, India, or the United States without ever crossing an international border. You cannot go very far in Tuvalu before you hit the sea and you're somewhere else. So that makes a difference in terms of what we're looking at. And then the other thing, so this is my slightly more sophisticated take on migration. It's not just that migration is a result of a number of different drivers or factors, but it's also that these factors are codependent. In other words, climate change may directly affect the likelihood of migration by making it harder or easier or riskier or less risky to live in a particular place or to move to another place, but it also differentially affects the economy and politics of different places, and so influences the economic or political calculus around whether you should move or not as well. And for that matter, economics and politics, of course, influence the extent and nature of environmental change as well. In short, what we have here is a wicked problem, a large-scale, long-term policy dilemma in which multiple and compounding risks and uncertainties combine with sharply divergent public values to generate contentious political stalemates. I got that from Wikipedia, by the way, just I can be Dr. Google for a moment. It is outrageously complicated, and I don't think that we can shy away from it. So that's the conceptualization bit. Maybe people will have some questions about that, and I'm sorry I've taken a long time, but I think it really bears thinking about what is the question we're asking ourselves first before we plow into then trying to seek the answers. Now, the first question I asked was, will future migration to the middle of the 21st century differ much to current patterns? But what are our current patterns, and how influenced are they by climate change or environmental change? And one of the problems with answering this is that most of the readily available migration statistics that we have are migration stocks. So typically, people born in, or perhaps nationals of any one country who are living in another country. And this is an example of that data. It actually draws on a UN database that we were involved in my previous university at Sussex at giving a first push to. There's a long and complicated story about why we focused on stocks, but what we do at least now have is stocks of migration measured in this way at different points in time, so at least we can see to a certain extent how migration has changed. I should say also there's a variant on this. The 2009 Human Development Report tried to do a similar thing for internal migration between regions or states within a country. So globally, what this type of analysis gets us is something like 220 million international migrants in the world, and that's actually the latest figure that was provided in the International Migration Report from IOM, and nearer to 1 billion migrants if you include people who've moved from state to state within India, from province to province within China, and so forth. But even here, the problem with this is that those people who were born in one place and are now living in somewhere else could have moved at any point in their lives. And indeed, these statistics include some people who never moved at all, but the boundary of the country changed. So they are now migrants, even though they have stayed exactly where they were in the first place. The biggest contributor to that being the change in the boundaries of the Soviet Union, with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you have one there right in the middle, Kazakhstan to the Russian Federation. That doesn't mean there are loads of Kazakh migrants and people leaving an oil-rich country to go to to go to Russia. No, not really. This is people who were declared migrants essentially by the breakup of the Soviet Union, and that is why the figure has remained unchanged between 2000 and 2017, because this is essentially a place where there is no movement. But as I say, we can look at this in terms of how stocks have changed over time, and if we look at this, and this is pulling out the top 15 corridors, we can see that some of these are active. So I pick out, the obvious ones are migration to the US, also migration to the Gulf. And if we were to include internal migration, I don't have a slide here, but the overwhelming contributor to internal migration is migration to eastern coastal areas of China, and also to Delhi and Mumbai and a few other large cities in India. So those are active routes. Then we've got others here that are mainly historic movements that are still represented in international migration statistics as large migration flows, but where actually the stock has declined. The one that I found most interesting here, and I haven't got another slide that picks it out, but Bangladesh to India is one that is often talked about in the migration climate literature, and maybe we'll hear a little bit about this in the last presentation today. So, Bangladesh is the poster child of climate change and of climate-related migration, and there is a lot of concern, at least in international bodies, about the movement of climate migrants from Bangladesh to Assam and to a lesser extent to West Bengal in India. But actually what this shows is that the numbers have gone down between 2000 and 2017. I think it's actually a bit more complicated than this shows. And then, of course, what this also doesn't show is any migration that is not picked out in censuses, because these data are driven by censuses. So West Africa is one of my principal areas of concern. Censuses in West Africa are infrequent and not entirely reliable when they are done. So that actually means that from this kind of data, migration in West Africa is largely absent, but we don't know if that is because it doesn't exist or because it's just not counted, or at least not counted in this particular way. I'd also say that that's my observation bias in figures. There's also some here that are visibly economic migration and others that are visibly refugees, and I just broke the rule that I gave at the beginning about not talking about those two categories, but it's really difficult not to, actually. How much of this is environmental? In how many of these cases is environmental change leading to more problematic, as in difficult to experience or difficult to handle, migration outcomes? So if we take the previous slide, I don't know if I can get back to it. Yes, I can. So if we take those 6 corridors that I've picked out there as having a growing volume of, broadly speaking, economic migration, perhaps, over the last 17 years, that added 10 million people to global migration stocks. Now, is any of that really environmental? It's sometimes claimed that Mexico to the United States is, although it certainly feels that there are a lot more salient factors than that going on. In particular, the economic success and demand for labor in California is a pretty powerful factor. And indeed, if one were to start digging into the environmental challenges associated with climate change that are faced in this part of the world, I think one might very quickly come to the conclusion that they are quite similar in California and Mexico. Not that all Mexican immigration has gone to California, of course. If we look at the Gulf, so India to the UAE, we've got India to Saudi Arabia, there are a few other Gulf migrations here. We have to accept, I think, that this is migration to one of the least hospitable parts of the world that is becoming less hospitable in the context of climate change. Somebody asked earlier whether there was research on adaptation to new climate zones. If you really wanted to do that, you'd do it with migrants to the Arabian Gulf, because that's where the change in climate circumstances is most extreme for the people who are moving there. But then, of course, you wouldn't do that because everybody understands that living in the Arabian Gulf is only possible because of technology. And so you immediately have to introduce, and as soon as you introduce technology into the equation, you realize that the link between people and their environment is not a simple one. And then the most visible climate change related displacement in North America in the last 20 years, I would argue, was Hurricane Katrina. I would credit it as having brought down George Bush. I mean, he served out his term, but it was the end of George Bush's currency as a president. So Hurricane Katrina actually resulted in some displacement, but it also resulted in a significant influx of Mexican and Central American workers to deliver reconstruction. So you can buy T-shirts. FEMA stands for Federal Emergency Management Agency. It's the federal agency that was tasked with reconstruction in New Orleans, but it has been changed. Down at the bottom there, need help with a national disaster, find every Mexican available. The point being made that lots of Mexicans moved to New Orleans, drawn there by the economic job of reconstruction of New Orleans. Now, is this migration associated with climate change? Yes, it is. But it is not what we classically think of as migration associated with climate change. And the Mexicans moving to New Orleans clearly are not climate migrants or climate refugees in the classical way that we understand them. And then I was going to say something about Syria as well, but I won't due to time. So moving on to the third part of what I wanted to say, and how are we going to move forward with any kind of understanding and let alone prediction of what might happen in the future, especially over a long time scale. Now, we did try to do this in this report, Migration and Global Environmental Change, a product of the Foresight unit of the UK government, part of its business innovation and skills department at the time. Foresight, as the name might imply, was set up specifically to try and answer questions about the medium to long-term future. It's a part of UK government that still exists. It's turned its hand to thinking about lots of difficult, wicked problems. Another one that had a lot of publicity around was a report on obesity, trying to look at what obesity would look like in 50 years and whether there is anything that we could do about it right now. More obviously, to my mind, a problem than the issue of migration. But anyway, I was persuaded to take part in this project. It was actually a really interesting project to be involved in. And we took a three-staged approach to trying to understand what migration might look like in the future. So first of all, we developed a model of the drivers of migration. Then we developed a model of the different migration challenges that we might consider to exist. And then we talked about scenarios for future migration. So I just want to run you quickly through those. Here's the model. You may have seen this in a slightly more elegant drawing in a paper that we published in Nature at the time of the publication of the report. The key thing here is that, as I've said already, we acknowledge that there are multiple drivers of migration, that it is net migration that we're concerned about, and also that there is a social context for migration. That's this bit over here. Actually, I'm not entirely happy with this model in terms of how it deals with the relative salience of individual and social conceptualization of migration. So this is still fundamentally a model that thinks about individual decision making. So this has had a lot of reporting on use in the literature, plenty of citations. A little bit less so this diagram. So we took this but then said, well, if we understand that as being what drives migration, what is this migration that it drives? And what we argued was that there are different kinds of mobility outcome, combinations of whether people move at all and whether this constitutes a challenge. The key question not being, is there migration, but is there migration that constitutes a public policy challenge? So I think we would all probably understand that forced displacement is a public policy challenge. It is less clear that people choosing to leave over the long term constitutes a public policy challenge. Although in this we accepted that there's challenges whatever happens, and so we divided actually into operational and geopolitical challenges. Operational challenges means, yes, there's an issue, there are things that need to be dealt with, but you would expect these to be dealt with within the normal business of government, whereas the geopolitical challenges means there needs to be an international discussion about how to deal with this because it's beyond the remit of one government to deal with it. And you'll notice also that we've included in here what we've very inelegantly called non-migration influenced by environmental change. So trying to get away from the idea that people not moving is a status quo and it's only the movement that we have to explain. it might need to be the other way around. It might be that movement is the natural order of things, and that when somebody is unable to move or chooses not to move, that that's the thing that we need to explain. So we'll come back to that. The final bit, and this is kind of futures methodology, we adopted a scenario framework to think about how this might pan out in different futures. It's a very crude scenario that we chose, a 2x2 matrix based on level of growth in the global economy on one axis, and the extent to which governance in the global economy is globally inclusive on the one hand, or more local or nationally exclusive on the other. So we come up with 4 scenarios of a future world that we tried to test what migration might look like in these different scenarios. So we have the top left, scenario A, high global growth, exclusive and fragmented governance, the fast rise of competing nation states, you could call that. Scenario B, high global growth, inclusive and connected governance, globalization as we have known it, the growth of the global economy but paralleled by the growth of international institutions that seek to deal with it. Down on the bottom left-hand corner, low global growth, exclusive and fragmented governance, what I would call stagnating nation states. And then scenario D on the bottom right, low global growth, inclusive and connected governance, global sustainability, perhaps at the expense of fuller poverty reduction. And in the report, we set out what we believe might be the outcomes under each of these scenarios. Lots of text here, but essentially there are some scenarios that we might be more worried about. In the previous diagram, they were M2, D2, and S2. They're the ones that require geopolitical action, they're geopolitical challenges. I should stress this is not a prediction of the future, but a way of thinking about how the future might look different under different scenarios. And what we said was that we would be most concerned about displacement if we have nationalism and the failure of global governance. We'd have the highest risk of people being trapped in such circumstances too, especially if this is linked to low growth. On the contrary, migration is likely to be highest if there is high growth, because growth itself contributes to migration, but also because growth contributes to climate change, which might contribute to migration. The more fragmented the international governance, the more this is likely to be unplanned. So I was going to pause a bit to ask the question about whether this is right, that open trade and global growth contributes to migration. I'm not entirely sure that that is right. But anyway, that is broadly speaking what we came up with in this report that was published in 2011. I've got 5 minutes, I think, to concentrate on what might have happened since. Well, what we have seen since 2011, actually since 2008 really, and the North Atlantic financial crash, is a lowering of global growth and a fragmentation of governance, essentially scenario C. So has this been associated with more trapped populations and more displacement? Well, certainly global displacement is up since 2011, after nearly 2 decades in which it was falling. We've had Syria, we currently have Venezuela, which I think is really one to look at. I would argue also that we've entered an era in which it is harder to migrate. So this is perhaps something that people might want to debate, but these are pictures of the Migrant Caravan that President Trump was railing against last year and citing it as an example of the pressure of migration. My interpretation of the caravan would be that this is an indication of how hard it now is to migrate. People got together as a migrant caravan to migrate together because they believed that that was the only way they were going to be able to get to the United States. And actually, I suspect that they were right in taking that action. So does this represent pressure to migrate, or does this actually represent a situation that we're in at the moment where migrating is much more difficult than it's been in the past. Just to give another example, and this is from a project that I'm developing at the moment, where in the context of Senegal, I think there's actually a case to be made that people are trapped in Senegal and other West African countries at the moment. Maybe that's the wrong word to use, and that migration outwards to Europe is increasingly challenging. So it depends entirely on how you interpret the shape of this graph. This is real flow data collected by Frontex at the European borders. So you can look at that. The first obvious thing you can see is that migration is seasonal. So there's a peak each year. And I don't think anybody would dispute that. But do we regard those 4 high years from 2014 to 2017 as an indication of secular growth? Or do we regard that as having ended and the 2018 and, well, we will see in 2019 as an indication that that period in which people were migrating is now at an end? And you can't really see this very well, but when you start to disaggregate this into different countries, what you actually see, and I've only included the West African countries here, and I'm afraid for some reason they're mostly in shades of green on the website that I took this from, so it's not so easy to see. But what you actually see is a lot of countries having a spike in migration, and then the migration going down. And if I'd included the Horn of Africa on here, the spikes are earlier. I had quite a bit that I wanted to cover here in relation to this, which I'm not going to. But let me just take the example of West and Central Africa. If we look at the last, okay, this is West and Central Africa, and is this to do with environmental change? According to the last seem to be missing a bit of my notes, but so according to the last International Migration Report, environmental changes in West and Central Africa are impacting on human livelihoods and mobility. So in that report, examples are given of food insecurity in West and Central Africa, but they're not directly related to migration. It then goes on to say, and I quote, "The complex and interconnected environmental changes such as droughts and floods, overexploitation of resources and climate change are contributing factors to rural, urban and cyclical mobility within countries and across borders in the region." But what they don't demonstrate is how this links in over time. So can we see anything here in the country peaks that appear to correspond with environmental shocks? And actually the key peak here, the thing that's driving more of this than anything, is the movement out of Nigeria. So that's the pale yellow that goes right up to the top of the graph in 2016 and 2017. Key issue here is surely that in 2016, Nigeria went into recession for the first time in 25 years. I could say much more about the history of this region, but just to look at crude oil prices, not something usually shown alongside migration data, but a clear association with the period of the collapse of crude oil prices, recession in the Nigerian economy, and I can say you can do the same thing for the Horn of Africa in relation to economic conditions in the Gulf and the level of migration from Ethiopia, Somalia, and Eritrea to the Gulf. So do we have here the kind of correlation that you see in Brinley Thomas's famous work, where when he looked at transatlantic migration at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the single biggest correlation was not famine and starvation in Europe, which is often assumed, but the construction of the American railroad. I realize that I have used my time, so let me just move forward to a conclusion. In this debate, I think what we often see is a lack of attention to time series, a lack of attention to multiple causality, a looseness in attribution to environmental factors, including sometimes assertions made with no evidence, and a lack of attention to major economic and political change. And indeed, also migration and displacement are treated as equivalent or interchangeable. If I think about 50 years' time, 2050 is 40 years' time, we will probably live in a much warmer world with much greater environmental challenges. Then as now, environmental challenges that relate to climate change will be a relevant factor in human movement. There will be problematic, even challenging migration associated with climate change that the international humanitarian community will need to address. Then as now, the actual movement of people is likely to be much more complex than people think. Mixed migration, if you like. Because movement, migration and displacement, does not adhere and never has adhered to simple policy categories. But I can't see any real evidence that this will be greater in volume then compared to now, except insofar as the world's population will likely be larger then, and if migration remains a constant proportion of the world's population, obviously migration would then be larger. Insofar as change is already happening, what we should perhaps be concerned about is the shift towards displacement rather than migration, and the growing phenomenon that people aspire to move, including to protect themselves against future displacement, but find it difficult or impossible to do so, a phenomenon that we've tried to call trapped. And what should we do? You might conclude from what I've just said that we should be focusing more on displacement rather than migration, and indeed there is already a trend here in terms of donor policy, and perhaps thinking more about people who are trapped. But the problem with this is that it would, in an important sense, be dealing with one of the symptoms rather than the causes. If my argument is correct, we're at greater risk of displacement and trapped populations, in significant part because the world is becoming more fragmented, nationalist, and exclusive, and because of the association of that with lower growth. Shouldn't we perhaps be asking if those trends are inevitable or not? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Richard. When I started listening to you, I came to think of one basic fact of migration and population dynamics that is seldomly taken up in this debate, and I think it resonates with what you said, what was your perspective on this, that whereas the basic demographic numbers are counted on births and deaths, then the last one, which is migration, is also, historically speaking, one which is notoriously difficult to predict. And I think that you made a very good points about this, that how there are, if you go and run into, let's say, too simple correlations, if I may, between different type of phenomena. It's something that we might simply forget this very basic feature. But in any case, so now we have time for questions. I do have one myself, but if you have, so just let me know. Yep.
Thank you very much. Tour de force. You've covered quite a lot of what could be established as fact, and that's helpful because that sets a very tangible basis for what we can talk about. I've got two questions. One is probably quite quick, and the other one possibly more difficult. I'd be interested in, did you develop in the Foresight project or afterwards the question of why people stay? So did you run a similar model which properly rephrases how we state the problem away from the obsession about migration. And possibly linked to that, here we're going into the kind of slightly more non-tangible problem around it, which you touched sort of on with regard to the displacement and a policy dynamic towards your concluding remarks, which links back to what Etienne has also shown, is that how we're dealing with migrants is framed and often grounded based on racism, or at least very, very difficult assumptions. So can your model cope with that kind of non-tangible data, but nonetheless discursively very important information, or making sense of migration more broadly? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I thought it was very important indeed to highlight that we also need to think about the role of fragmented governance in more nationalist sort of parties, and how people respond to that, and how that's impacting on migration. And I like that was very key and central in the scenarios. But I still wonder then, what about the climate change scenarios with the 1 degree, 2 degree, and the different sort of implications of sea level rise, and how well an inclusive, well-coordinated governance setting could continue to cope with the different scenarios of climate change. I just wondered if in the Foresight report, in thinking, also there has been a focus on that.
So thank you for both of those questions. So on the first two questions, so I think I need to go back to what kind of models the three things that I put up were. And so these are not predictive models. I mean, I've had a go at predictive models as well through agent-based modeling, which is another story. But these models are conceptual models. So they are about trying to sort out in our minds what are the underlying concepts that are enabling us to create the knowledge in the first place. So in that context, no, we didn't explicitly seek to model people staying as an outcome, except insofar as the second of those models clearly did have people staying as one of a range of logical outcomes if you start from the perspective, the theoretical perspective that we start from. So the actual predictive models that we've started to try and develop around agent-based modeling, certainly, yes, staying is one of the outcomes, and there's an explicit modeling of that. I think that the phenomenon of people staying and what public policy does with that is a hugely challenging area. I've not had, and if so, what would we do with that? That's a question that we've tried to throw out from the report. I'm not sure that it has adequately been answered, including by ourselves, or indeed that much picked up yet, which is one of the reasons why I'm still interested in talking about it. Ingrid, your question was, sorry. Yes, the climate change scenarios. So no, we have not overlaid climate change scenarios onto this. We didn't get time in the report to do it. It's one of my regrets that we didn't have time to formally model that. That would be the next logical step. So you take these scenarios and you develop them, and then you say, okay, what then happens if you overlay 1.5 degrees, 3 degrees, and so on. And I think some of the pathways work that has been done since then would help in the development of that, where I feel at the time in 2011, we were not sure that the modelling of the climate scenarios was sufficiently well advanced to have a good handle on what this would work out as once you move from a 2 by 2 matrix to what would essentially be a 2 by 2 by 3, 4 matrix incorporating climate change as well. I mean, there was also a feeling amongst the group that put this together that as soon as you move beyond 2 dimensions in any kind of modelling, it becomes much more difficult to engage with and understand for lay audiences. And one of our audiences certainly was lay non-scientific audiences. But it's a good point.
Thank you. I could ask you one question. It was touched in both of the 2 previous presentations. In Finnish media, it has been stated, kind of like as factual that climate-induced change was a significant driver for the Syrian conflict. And Etienne also mentioned about that, so maybe you could share your views on this issue.
You want me to do that now or wait for the second question? Should I do that now?
If you do that now.
Okay, so I'm not an expert on Syria. I'm not an expert on Syria. But it seems to me fairly clear that the Syrian conflict has to do with wider economic and political changes in the world and with foreign intervention in the region. Now, whether climate is also a factor alongside that, maybe, but it seems to me incontrovertible that there is a new version of superpower rivalry that is playing out in Syria, and that there are also substantial economic and political factors within Syria itself that have contributed to the current situation. Should also say I heard a keynote last week at our university by a Syria expert who put the Syria crisis into a 200-year perspective, pointed out the extent of forced migration and economic migration in the region over that period. It is a period in which Damascus in particular, but other parts of Syria as well, saw substantial in-migration associated with similar kinds of economic and political upheaval. The Ottoman Empire had a refugee code before there even was an international community. And her argument was that the events of 2014, 2015 were hugely exceptional in Syrian history. And of course we now see most recently queues of people at the Syrian border trying to get back into Syria. Anyway, that's I think enough of my ramblings about Syria. I'm not an expert, but I am utterly unconvinced that we can describe this as an environmental migration.
Final question.
Thank you very much. This is, I guess, rather a comment from the Horn of Africa. So what we can see, what's happening there is that it's a very heavy urbanization. So people are moving from rural areas to towns and cities because it's not feasible. Pastoralism as a way of life is not perhaps feasible anymore. People have lost their cattle, and due to extended routes, it's getting very hard to that way of life. And those people who are leaving from the Horn, they are leaving mostly from these rural centers, not from urban centers, from towns and cities. But it may take time, perhaps several years. So how can we assess, is it that people are leaving? Can we say that it's partly because of environmental change? Because this has been perhaps one of the root causes why people have migrated to towns and urban centers? Or is it for economic reasons? Or is it, as you say, that it's mixed?
So again, I'm not an expert on the Horn, but my understanding, and I've read rather more about the Horn than I have about Syria, my understanding is that it is really difficult to separate out what are undoubtedly challenging environmental circumstances in parts of the Horn at the moment, with a whole series of other factors that are ongoing, a history of war, of course, forced displacement, including planned resettlement that is, on the part of the Ethiopian government, was often described in environmental terms, but clearly involved other factors as well. Then also the increasing salience of migration to the Gulf, and to what extent do we say that migration to the Gulf is caused by deteriorating factors in the Horn? To what extent is it drawn by the growth of the Gulf economy? Well, one handle on that is the extent to which there has been movement in the opposite direction since the faltering of the Gulf economy, for the same reasons as I pointed out for Nigeria, the fall in global oil prices. So my urging here is not to say that environment is not a factor. It's only to resist the temptation to single it out as the only or principal factor, and to disregard all of the other factors that are also important. And I've left you, just in case you were wondering, that's an aerial view of the island, one of the main island of Tuvalu. Again, a poster child of environmental migration. But again, the same thing applies there. In Tuvalu, there is a long history of migration associated with movement to the phosphate mines in Nauru, which have now been exhausted. So Tuvalu's population had grown as a consequence of people returning from phosphate mining. There is also, of course, demand for workers in New Zealand and Australia. That's one of the reasons why both countries have been willing to take in the very small number of Tuvaluans who exist through economic migration schemes. And indeed, there's also changes in Tuvalu itself associated with the growth of its GDP, which is somewhat implausibly linked with the rise of the internet, the creation of the .tv internet suffix, which is owned by Tuvalu and which constitutes a third of Tuvalu's GDP. And that has strengthened the government of Tuvalu and orientated internal migration within Tuvalu from outlying islands to the main island, which, as you can see, is very small. It's an island in which the airport, I believe, takes up about a third of the space of the island. So my message is not that environmental change is irrelevant, but that we have a very complex set of issues in which politics, economics, demographics, social change are all bound up, and migration goes up and down and in different directions.